Happy Wax on Wednesdays. I wanted to show you, before we get started with this week's project, I wanted to show you some of the tiles that have 2 coats of resin on them now from last week. And I've given them all 2 coats of resin, and you can see all the depth that's in there, right down to the alcohol ink backgrounds and the encaustic infused papers. And 2 layers of resin really gives a really pretty glassy-like effect and adds a lot of depth to these collage pieces. And I go ahead and sand the bottoms when I'm done. And these were just so fun because you can see this one's not sitting level because it's not been sanded yet. This was so fun, and these alcohol inks are so vibrant, and then of course the matte infused encaustic papers, and this process gives a chance for mediums that normally can't come together to come together in this process, because alcohol inks do best on a non-porous surface like Yupo paper and things like that, where it's a non-porous surface, it's drying on the top, and of course encaustic needs a porous surface. So this was just kind of a perfect union of them to have the opportunity to come together, and wow, what just a really brilliant effect that was. And so I'm really excited also to tell you that this is now a workshop. This Encausticology Collage Minis is now a full-on workshop where I show you absolutely step by step, every step in the process in videos of how to do this from beginning to end, including a huge section on collaging these fun papers. So just making stacks and stacks and stacks of these fun collage papers in several different ways of painting the backgrounds with alcohol inks, and then of course that no stressing with the resin finish on top. So this is a whole workshop. It opens on Sunday. Now there's an early bird special that opened on Monday for 20% off of the price of the workshop, and you have the workshop once you purchase it with lifetime access, just like all of my Encausticology workshops. They're all lifetime access, and you can go back and view them whenever you want, 24/7. So I just wanted to show you what they look like after 2 coats, and it's so shiny and pretty, and I get really excited about that. I also got questions. I've got several questions as a result of this process, and I want to answer a couple of them here in this week's Wax on Wednesday. And one of them is I didn't know that resin would stick to the encaustic. You think of resin, you think of a plastic. Encaustic and plastic, of course, don't go together, which is why you can't use acrylic paint, but resin will stick to anything. So resin can go on top of encaustic. Encaustic cannot go on top of resin because it's not a porous surface. So the resin will go on as an adhesive and dry on almost any surface at all, including metal. Resin is the powerhouse there that will adhere to encaustic. But the thing is normally after painting encaustic for 17 years, I will tell you that why would you do that on an encaustic painting, a beautiful encaustic painting that has its own, where encaustic is its own finish. I would never promote on a painting on board, a strict encaustic painting, putting a resin finish over that, because it detracts from the beautiful finish, the beautiful natural and organic encaustic finish. But in pieces like this, once again, comes together when you can bring just a lightly infused encaustic paper and bring that together with other mediums and collage and resin, then I'm an advocate for that. And I'm also an advocate if it's a sculptural piece and the resin is going to help the structural integrity of the piece, then I would also advocate using resin over encaustic or with encaustic in that situation. So I just wanted to answer your questions a little bit, because I've gotten quite a few on all across media this week on that resin and encaustic question. So I just wanted to answer that. So if it's a sculptural piece and it's going to enhance the structural integrity of the piece, that resin, because resin is very strong, I would say yes. If it is a case like this where it's just kind of a perfect harmony with those lightly infused encaustic papers and the ability to bring mediums together that normally wouldn't be able to be together, yes. On a 20 by 20 encaustic painting, I would say no. But that's my personal opinion. Can it happen? Yeah, it can. But for me, as an artist, that would detract from the beautiful finish that is encaustic, which is why I've worked in encaustic so long, is that beautiful, beautiful natural organic finish. So that's the long answer to a short question of can encaustic and resin be used together. So let's get started on this week's project, and it's continuing with the tiles. I had a little challenge here with another question. And the question was, hey, I love those tiles. Can I use that encaustic wax directly on that tile? And we can't, because the tile is glossy tile. It's not absorbent at all. Not probably right away, but somewhere in the future, that wax is gonna crack and it's gonna pop off. So the short answer to that is nope, you can't use encaustic on ceramic tile that has that glossy finish. But this week I had a challenge, and I'm going to show you how you can use encaustic on these tiles. So let's get started. Okay, so the challenge this week is, can we use encaustic on these glossy fired ceramic subway tiles? And of course the answer straight off is no, but I'm going to make it an absorbent finish. And so by this, I'm going to add some Arches watercolor paper. The Arches watercolor is super heavyweight watercolor paper. So it's going to be perfect to make this an absorbent surface. Any heavyweight watercolor paper or heavy photo paper, something that's really absorbent, a really absorbent paper, is going to work perfect. And of course, the Arches, it's already archival, it's watercolor paper, perfect. I'm also using a bookbinder's glue, which is also archival, acid-free, and I'm just going over making sure there's no air bubbles in here with my brayer, putting a copy paper over that because my brayers are always dirty. And I did a couple of them here, and I weighted them down and let them set overnight. And I wanted to make sure that there's no air bubbles whatsoever. And so I really make sure that I brayer them for a few minutes and really make sure that there's a good, it's really adhered well with that bookbinder's glue before I go ahead and weight them down and let them dry completely overnight. And here I'm just sanding them down a little bit, taking some, I think this is 220 grit. It sands the edges of the paper right off, so I don't have to take an X-Acto knife or anything like that to them. I just sand the edges right to the tile, and they are ready to go after that. So I'm also, when I'm sanding, I'm making sure that there's no lift, no air bubbles, because once you add the encaustic wax, it's going to exaggerate any air bubbles that you have between your secondary substrate and your first substrate. So you really want to make sure that take your time with that gluing process and make sure that it's really adhered well to your substrate, because you don't want any lift. And here I'm going to add just a few coats of clear encaustic medium, and you can see here, I'll point it out if you can't see right away on the camera. After that first coat, you can still see that texture from that watercolor paper, because the watercolor paper is so absorbent and it absorbs not evenly across the board there. So I'm going to add about 3 or 4 coats of the encaustic medium to the surface in just little thin coats, not big gloppy mess here, but just little thin coats to try and get a nice clean, smooth surface to work with. So I'm using my heat gun on my lightest setting and adding just really thin coats there to get it started. Once I have a really nice, smooth, fused encaustic finish, then I can go ahead and add some texture. So here I'm just adding some dry brush texture, accretion method, whatever you'd like to call it. I'm building up the texture. It takes several minutes, and this is best done on a cooled off board. So this is set out for a few minutes and cooled down before after fusing it, before I came back and started building that up. So if you're having trouble building up your texture, you might be working on a board that's too warm, and you might want to cool that down for a little bit. Working on multiple boards at one time really helps with this, because you can set one aside and let it cool down. And here this is the second one. I've added some white encaustic medium. Again, same thing, adding 3 or 4 coats of light coats of white encaustic paint to these, and until I build up a nice, really nice smooth surface. And I always build up, I always fuse my surfaces flat to begin with, and then if I want to continue to add texture or something like that, I can further down the road, but I always start with a really smooth finish. And this is going back to the first piece, going back and forth now, and it cooled down again, and so I had time to cool down, and I'm going ahead and really building up that finish now. This is completely cooled down board, and I'm going to build this up for just several minutes. This, of course, the video is sped up, but several minutes of really building that texture up, and you can keep going as long as you want, and really build up that texture. And when I fuse it, of course, I'm just fusing it really lightly, just to a glisten. Back to the second board. I decided on this one that this is the one that has the white paint on it. I'm going to just put a picture transfer. This is a laser copy transfer from my laser printer, and this is just a image of one of my vintage cameras, and I'm going over it again several minutes with a spoon, every single direction, really making sure I get the corners and the edges and all areas of this image, because I want a good transfer. So if you think that you've burnished it enough, then burnish it again, just for just do it, set a timer, do it on a piece like this, 4x4, burnish it for 5 minutes, really going at it, get a little workout there as you go, and go in circles and everything else, because it's really difficult to, once you begin to remove the paper, you can't go back and add that image in. So you really want to make sure that, again, you take your time, slow with this process, and really make sure that you get a good, that you adhere the paper well to the surface. And this surface is also slightly warmed. Not squishy warmed, but it is slightly warmed with the heat gun before I go ahead and add the transfer. And here I'm just taking and wetting the entire paper with my hands. I find that my bare hands works better than the gloved hands for this part of the transfer, removing the paper. And I'm just going to do this very lightly, removing the paper until there's absolutely no more paper left. And then your image, the ink from the laser transfer, will be transferred onto the encaustic surface. So you just keep at this. It takes, again, quite a few minutes to get all that bald paper off, but just keep going at it until there's absolutely no paper left and just the ink and the image sitting on top of that encaustic surface. And the last step on this one is just to give it a really light fusing so that image is fused into the wax, and it is done. And on the second one, I want to really make that texture, bring that out and make it pop. So I'm using my favorite indigo in the RNF paint stick and some white, and just blending that in the whole way. And this is just a fun little way to really make that texture that was created really pop and stand out. And the oil pigment sticks are fun because you can blend them just right there on your piece. So these 4x4s ended up being just a whole bunch of fun, and it would be fun to put a whole series together of these little 4x4s, and they're super inexpensive because you're just using a piece of watercolor paper and a really inexpensive tile. So even cheaper than buying a 4x4 little wood panel. Sometimes those can get really expensive. So if you're just playing around with different techniques, then this is a really fun little way to create your own practice boards, and they make fun little displays afterwards. So I hope you really enjoyed this Wax on Wednesdays, and we will see you next week. Have fun, guys.